Hello, everyone. I'm Peter Zemsky, a professor of strategy and innovation here at INSEAD. Welcome to today's Tech Talk. We're going to be talking about Web3 and the future of the internet. This is going to be a fireside chat format. Before I introduce our speaker, let's get out of the way a little bit of logistics, please. So the main thing here to note is the Q&A tab is open right in front of me. As you're listening to the conversation, do put in your questions, do vote up the questions that you'd like to hear as follow-up for our speaker today. We look to make this a little bit interactive. All right, so our topic today is indeed the future of the internet, and specifically the topic of Web3. We're welcoming back to Tech Talks Alex Tapscott. He's been a big thinker in the space, at least since 2016, when he published his best-selling co-authored book, Blockchain Revolution. And we are super fortunate to have Alex with us today, just after the launch of his latest book. Here you go, Web3, Charting the Internet's Next Economic and Cultural Frontier. We're going to find out what that's all about. Alex, welcome back to Tech Talks.
Well, Peter, it's great to see you, and I'm delighted to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
All right. So we have a diverse audience typically. So let's start briefly at the beginning. What is Web3 all about? Why the excitement? What motivated you to pour your energy into this new book? Maybe I got an early, what's the difference between Web3 and say Web 1 or 2? What are really the defining features of what you're talking about?
Sure, absolutely. Well, every so often, a new technology comes along that transforms the economic order of things in kind of profound and unexpected ways. And we've seen that play out time and again through history, whether it was the rise of the first era of the internet, or the rise of the transistor and the computer, or radio, or TV, or even the steam engine. And we're in this really interesting period right now where several technologies are all kind of emerging at once. We're seeing the rise of AI, which is, I think, helping us to reimagine what we thought both machines and people were capable of. And that could unleash new kinds of productivity and also raise all sorts of new challenges. We're seeing the rise of extended reality, which is an overnight success story that is many decades in the making, but seems to have hit an inflection point. And that, I think, promises to take our web from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, or from 2.5D to 3D. We're also seeing the rise of blockchains, which began with Bitcoin. Blockchains are a technology which enable people and businesses to move value peer-to-peer and to organize complex business processes. And then finally, we're seeing the rise of the Internet of Things, or broadly speaking, connected devices. Already, there are more devices with internet connections than people, and that's only going to grow. So these are all technologies that are not separate, but related. In the same way that the term internet came to describe a whole range of different technologies, business models, and social behaviors, I believe that the term Web3 is going to help to define this next era of the web, and with it, the internet itself. So I think in order to understand this, it's helpful, as you said, to kind of understand what came before. So Web 1 is what they call the read web. Basically a medium for the presentation of information on static websites. So, if any alumni here were around in the 90s, the .com era is basically what I'm talking about. In the sort of early to mid 2000s, some innovations occurred which changed the web into a collaborative medium. It led to the rise of user-generated content and collaborative apps and social media. And Web 2 had a lot of sort of positive impacts. It created lots of economic gain, it expanded internet connectivity, and it improved access to information in ways that really wasn't possible before. But it came with some pretty steep downsides. Advertising basically became the sort of the main business model for the web. And as a result, a lot of Web 2 companies worked hard to keep people on the platform. Recommendation engines fed them disinformation, and other content, which encouraged them to stick around, but also led to sort of a fragmentation of social discourse. And then the bigger issue is that it led to sort of monopoly economics in several areas, including in things like search, social media, and even in operating systems. So all of this, happened in a period of time where users were providing all this data, but losing their privacy. So the web is now entering a new era, right? So Web 1 was the read web, and Web 2 is the read-write web, a way to access information, but also share your own content. Then Web 3 is the read-write own web. And own here is own and ownership is sort of the operative word here. Web3 gives people a way to express digital property rights over the most important asset class of our age, which is things like data, our identities, our digital creations, and our digital goods, our digital assets, which can include not just money, but basically anything of value. And we're seeing the rise of these different technologies all kind of converging together. And I believe that historians will look back at this period of time not as the era of blockchain or AI or virtual reality or the metaverse, but rather as the Web3 era.
Okay, so big piece of this is this ownership of these various digital assets and goods. What about this dominance of big tech? How does that going to potentially play out with this technology? Maybe you could talk a little bit about how fundamental blockchain and DLT more generally is to what you're envisioning for Web3.
Yeah, absolutely. There was an expression in 2008 that the big banks were too big to fail. And I think that when it comes to big tech, they're too big to care. Too big to care about privacy, too big to care about fair play, too big to care in some cases about regulations or competition. And that is a status quo that I think is frankly unsustainable. So what Web3 enables basically is a web where internet users have more control. They have more control over their data. They're able to transact peer-to-peer, which by its very nature reduces the need for intermediaries and platforms. And importantly, it gives people a way to become owners of the applications and services that they use. So in Web 1 and Web 2, we were internet users. In Web 3, we're internet owners. So what does that mean in practice? Well, a lot of Web 3 applications enable early users and developers and contributors to basically earn a share of the platform or the service that they're using in the form of a token reward. And that token gives the user an economic stake in the service and the network that they're using. It also gives them the ability to vote, to have governance over how that service is run. And so my thesis, and I think a lot of people in this industry would agree, is that user-owned networks might behave differently. A user-owned network might not choose to maximize user data in order to sell ads. It may choose to operate a sort of minimum viable level of profit, so to create the best possible experience for users. So there are a lot of examples already in Web3. This is not a hypothetical. And one of the areas where this is happening right now is in finance and financial services. So there's an area of Web3 known as decentralized finance, or DeFi, where a lot of applications have emerged to solve many problems that exist in financial services: how we move value, how we store value, how we access credit, how we trade, and so forth. And on the trading one, there's one in particular, Uniswap, which is a decentralized exchange that allows people to trade any asset really out there, peer-to-peer. And the more that you trade and the more you provide liquidity to this platform, the more you earn in the platform itself. And so that model of user ownership can be applied to basically any kind of service or application online.
That's great. So it's going to be really helpful to dig in with you to some of these use cases. Obviously, you have a background in finance. You understand that ownership side really well. Maybe just one more building block before we delve into that and really look at the landscape. In the book, you talk quite a bit about the importance of tokens. Maybe you want to just get that clear for the audience before we dive into more use cases.
Yeah. Well, the word token, in a way, it seems kind of like an odd one for such an important innovation transformation, but it turns out that it's actually quite appropriate. So I think a lot of people confuse or get the idea of a cryptocurrency and a token mixed up, and for good reason. I think that as something is evolving, there are lots of different terms we're using to describe things, but basically, a cryptocurrency is a very specific thing. It is a digital medium for value. It's a way to, basically to move and store money, right? So what is money? Money is a unit of account, a store of value, and a medium of exchange.
Hmm.
But most tokens are not just trying to be currencies. A token
So
is
just to be
best.
clear, so token, I mean, these cryptocurrencies are one type of token, but your point is tokens are much broader, I think.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Peter. That's helpful. Yeah, so I think the best way to think about it is a token is like a container for value. So think about a shipping container that's like traveling across the Pacific Ocean. You know, a shipping container can contain food, it can contain furniture, it can contain computers, whatever. And a website, in a way, is sort of like a container for information, right? A website can be programmed to contain, you know, a storefront or a newspaper or the classifieds or a way to access your, you know, health records or a search engine or whatever, like an infinite number of configurations. And so just as there are kind of an infinite number of configurations for a website, there are kind of an infinite number of configurations for a token. A token can be money, it can be stock, it can be art or collectible, it can be IP, it can be a vote in an election. Anything that requires scarcity to have value, a token can be programmed to represent that. And I think that as a result, you know, the economic frontier for tokens is kind of boundless. Now, in the book, Web3, Charting the Internet's Next Economic and Cultural Frontier, I have updated this thing I've been working on for a couple of years called the token taxonomy. And the token taxonomy is basically you know, a graph or a graphic that describes the 11 different kinds of tokens that have found product market fit so far. And I think that right now in this early stage, it's very helpful to have a taxonomy, but I think eventually, like, my taxonomy will be so ridiculous. It'll be so silly, the idea that there are these 11 uses for tokens. It'll be like, you know, someone saying, here are the 11 things you can do with a website, right? I mean, like, you would never do that today because there are an infinite number of configurations, and people understand that now about websites, but they don't yet still understand that about tokens.
Right. So maybe, as you said, you've looked at a lot of these different use cases. You talked about just about one. I think it'd be helpful for people, and there's even a question in the Q&A already. Could you lay out a few more of what you find, both promising existing use cases, so things that are, as you said, we're seeing today, but also things that seem to be emerging?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that if the question is about tokens, I mean, we can talk about lots of different examples. One great example are stablecoins. So stablecoins are, you know, digital tokens, goods that are backed by dollars, US dollars. And those dollars are typically held, you know, in reserve somewhere at a bank or held in US government debt. So the biggest issuers would be companies like Circle and Tether, but also PayPal just announced its own stablecoin, and we've seen Visa integrate stablecoins into its merchant payments. So that's one example. Another example is securities tokens. So
just to remind people, why are stablecoins so important in this emerging Web3?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of one of the ironies of Web3 in a sense, because you know, Web3 began with technology innovations like blockchain, and blockchain got its start with Bitcoin. And Bitcoin, I think, you know, a lot of people think of as this way to move money without the need for an intermediary. And also because it's not issued by a government, it's sort of this voluntary currency. But what we've seen is blockchains have been operationalized for stablecoins. And in a way, Web3's first killer application is actually the US dollar. There are billions of people all around the world that want a way to store value in dollars. To store and move value in dollars. It's something that we might take for granted in places like the United States or Canada to a lesser extent, or in Europe. And I know INSEAD's you know, alumni network is global in nature. But if you look at stablecoin usage, it's very popular in places like Turkey and Nigeria and Lebanon and places in the world where people maybe don't necessarily trust the local financial system, where maybe the local currency is kind of unreliable, or where the government, you know, might be corrupt. And so what we're seeing is stablecoins basically like Venmo for the world. You know, people think, oh, we've got Venmo in the United States, why do we need stablecoins? It's like, well, what you're doing with Venmo is just moving money between two accounts on the same ledger at the same bank. So if you're an American, that's great. But if you're anywhere else in the world, you're kind of out of luck. So stablecoins are a way to digitize the dollar. And that's, I mean, it's had huge product market fit. Like the market cap for stablecoins is over $130 billion. $8 trillion of transactions in stablecoins cleared on the Ethereum blockchain last year, and that's just one network. of many. So this is a massive market already. At the same time, Clay Christensen, who I'm sure many of people on this call are familiar with, did say that markets that do not exist cannot be analyzed. And he also added that not only are the market applications for disruptive technology unknown at the time of their development, they are unknowable. And by that, he just basically meant a lot of people, when new technologies come along, are looking for use cases. Like, how does this make what I'm doing better? And, we've seen in the past that kind of feedback before. It's like, why do I need email when I've got a telephone? Why do I need a credit card when I've got cash? What problem does this solve? I can still go to the store and buy things. What problem does this credit card solve? And I think the same thing is kind of true for this technology as well. But at the same time, when it comes to the tokens, there are tons of clear examples and where it's being used today. Stablecoins is one. This week, Citibank announced that it's planning on tokenizing its customer deposits for its institutional clients. And JP Morgan is looking at a thing called a reserve token or deposit token, which basically, deposit money on deposit at a bank can be tokenized as a way to allow it to be moved more freely around the world, the global economy. So there are lots of examples, Peter, where incumbent firms and leaders of the old paradigm are embracing this technology. But at the same time, as with any new tech, a lot of this is going to happen not in big business, but on the frontier of this new technology.
Yeah, who are the, again, I want to probe a little more this different landscape. You nicely bring up examples both of incumbents, crypto type players like Tether, plus big tech as well plays in the space. But maybe, since you alluded to Christensen, who's at risk of disruption in this space in terms of functions, in terms of industries? Who are the JC Penney's or the blockbusters who should be worried about what's coming?
It's a question I think about a lot because, if we look at the web, the first era of the web, with what we know today, we look back at that time, those companies that you just described all had a fatal flaw, which is that they were going to be disrupted by the first era of the web, by the Internet of Information. So what businesses today are going to suffer the same fate? I'm not sure that there are a lot of companies that are going to go under in quite the same way that certain brick and mortar retailers or other companies in the information business, like say Polaroid or Kodak, might, right? Because of the rise of digital photography. But I do believe that a lot of companies that are today very large and powerful will find in the future that they are diminished in systemic importance and in size and maybe in profitability. We can look back at Web 1 and Web 2 and even the pre-internet era, and there are lots of companies that continue to exist today that are quite large and still make a lot of money, right? Companies like HP or HPE or IBM or General Electric, or even companies that predate that. They maybe didn't capture the zeitgeist when it came to Web 2. Most of that value accrued to the platforms, but they're still doing okay. They're just diminished in size. So I think about, in the past 20 years, $10 trillion of value market capitalization has been created in, 6 companies, pretty much, right? The big internet platforms. Where's the next $10 trillion of value going to get created? I mean, are these companies going to double in size in the next 5 years? Or, and I think what is more likely is that, as with other eras, there's going to be a new crop of winners. Maybe they won't be big companies in the traditional sense of the word, but the value capture is going to occur somewhere else. And that's something that, we've seen play out. Christensen, just to sort of tie the bow on that one, said that ironically or counterintuitively, the best run companies are the ones that often find it hardest to embrace new technology because their existing customers are not clamoring for it. Their existing businesses are the ones that are most profitable. And new technology is often unproven and frankly, not that lucrative. And we can see there are so many examples of this, in business. The rise of the PC. Enterprises were never going to use personal computers because they used mini computers and mainframes, for example. Companies were never going to use the open internet because they wanted closed loop systems. American motorists were never going to buy Honda motorcycles because they wanted big Harleys. And today, one of the things I think about as it relates to tokens, and I want to move to some other topics, but one of the benefits of tokens is that you can custody them yourself. You can hold your own You can be your own wallet, right? You can have your own value, and you can move that peer to peer. I think for a lot of legacy existing customers in the United States, like that's not that appealing. It's like, why I want to put my money and my assets in the bank. But for a lot of people in the world, it's a superpower. If they don't have access to those same kinds of financial tools, and for a younger generation, it's neither a superpower nor a hindrance. It's just a reality. They're used to buying digital goods in Fortnite and Roblox and these other environments, and the idea of like buying assets and then owning them and then being able to do with them what you want, having property rights over your digital self the way you do over your physical self, is completely second nature to a younger generation. And so that to me like strikes at the heart of the dilemma that a lot of existing companies face.
I love the topic of the sort of, you've been bringing up the geographic spread. Where is this going to take off? But I want to park that for a second, because there is this sort of elephant in the room of Web3, which is in the core crypto stuff from 22, all the sort of the fraud, the growing government regulation, which may make some of the innovation of unknown applications harder. So I guess let's just, and I have at least one question alluding to that. But so what do you think? What are the impacts, the lessons for Web3 from the crypto scandals in 22, FTX, Terra Luna, Celsius? What's your view on that?
Well, in a sense, they helped to increase my urgency to get this book out, because I was in the middle of researching and writing this book when the FTX scandal broke. And I think, like a lot of people, it caused some self-reflection and some soul searching, which is that here was a company that had grown to an enormous size in a short period of time and was kind of a systemically important entity in the whole space. Now, and it turns out that the leaders were incompetent and probably also fraudulent and, committing all sorts of crimes. And it made me think, like, could this be something that really sets the industry back? I had a really interesting conversation with Albert Wenger, who's one of the founders of Union Square Ventures, and he wrote this great book about the world after capital. And he explained it this way, and I interviewed him right around the time that this all broke. He's like, look, Alex, lots of times when there's a new technology, there's some disaster in the early days. And oftentimes, the technology keeps on moving. Like with the invention of the steam engine was originally used to keep air circulating in mines, right? Lots of coal mines collapsed, but we kept on producing coal. Lots of trains derailed, and we kept on, building railways. Lots of banks went under during the Western expansion of the United States, but people kept kind of pushing forward. So he said, basically, a lot of technologies are kind of unstoppable forces. But then he said some technologies have just as much potential, but have some sort of fatal event that occurs to them. And he pointed to civilian nuclear technology. He said, look, like if we were running on nuclear power, we could reduce the carbon footprint of the world by 2/3, probably. We could actually achieve most of the climate objectives. And, the data, it basically corroborates his opinion. He said, but we had 3 Mile Island in the US, and then we had Chernobyl. And Chernobyl changed the public consciousness around nuclear power. And it changed it so much that it prevented it from reaching its potential. Now, nuclear power is still a very important part of our energy mix. And, it's, if anything, it's now finally having a renaissance 40 years later, 30 years later. But, that event kind of really put the pause on it. And there have been other examples of this throughout history. The South Sea Company was this, a limited liability corporation that was formed in the 1700s in England. And the South Sea bubble was such a disaster that the government basically banned the formation of joint stock companies for 100 years. Now, that didn't stop the corporation from becoming the main artifact that we use today to like organize capability and to but
it could still slow it down by 100 years.
But it's slowed it down by 100 years. So it's like when you're writing a book about a new innovation, and in a way, you might think a company is not an innovation, but it actually is. I think some of these like legal fictions and creations that are actually more profound than the actual technology themselves, which I'd love to discuss further. But In the case of nuclear power, it's taken decades for the public to kind of belatedly kind of come around to this, and even then, there's still a lot of mixed opinions. So you're thinking to yourself, is FTX the Chernobyl for crypto? Now, again, Web3 to me is about more than crypto, and there are these other technologies that are intersecting with tokens and blockchains, but it's still something that caused me to think quite hard about it. And the conclusion that I came to was that it wasn't. Not only because crypto is just one component of this entire story, but also because I feel like the reaction from the industry has been pretty good so far, which is that ultimately the failure of FTX was not a failure of technology like crypto assets. Tokens did not have a nuclear meltdown, as it were. What happened was that we saw the incompetence and hubris of some individuals. During the great financial crisis, people were blaming the banks rightly for their behavior. But very few people, other than maybe some Marxists, were saying the problem is money itself, right? And when Enron went under, it wasn't the problem is not natural gas futures or power dams. The problem was the corruption and fraud of a bunch of individuals. And as more and more information has come to light, that's quite clearly what's happened with FTX. So I do think it's something that doesn't actually impact it long term, but in the moment, it was certainly something that caused some soul searching.
Let me push you a little bit, because one of the key, there's ownership, but also you highlight, decentralization is really an important promise of DLT and Web3. And clearly there was an element which is, although, there's a lot of talk in the crypto space about decentralization, in fact, it wasn't very decentralized. And we ended up, one perhaps lesson of FTX is we created centralized finance without regulation. And that in hindsight, it's easy to say, oh, that doesn't sound like such a good idea. So maybe and again, at least for me, just being someone who teaches on digital, part of the issue is sometimes today, it's like early internet, the user experience isn't that great. It's not that easy to actually to realize the promise of decentralization. Does that resonate with you, or you?
A little bit. Well, I agree with what you said, Peter, which is that as with other, early technologies, it's early adopters and first movers who are taking advantage of it, and the mass market typically follows a little bit later. And I think that in a way, look, not to get too bogged down on the crypto thing, but the benefit of tokens are that they're provably scarce. So, blockchains allow you to know that you alone own something and not someone else, and you can move it peer to peer globally. And that's something that has profound implications for every industry, especially financial services. But also, because it's clunky, people use exchanges as on-ramps to get into the industry. And I think done well, on-ramps can be really useful as a way to smooth out the process of becoming onboarded. There was the World Wide Web was invented in 1989, but it wasn't until the Mosaic browser a few years later that people actually had a way to navigate the World Wide Web. So in a way, I think of some of these companies as sort of like on-ramps to Web3 in the same way that browsers are kind of on-ramps to Web1. And I think that they can be useful. Now, in terms of regulation.
Yeah, actually, just to focus that, I'm just curious, where do you come out in sort of, what's the ideal role of government and regulation as we try and steer between, I guess, some consumer protections and anti-fraud, whereas also allowing the innovation that you're calling for?
Yeah, well, I think you just nailed the balance that everyone needs to try to strike. The book is called Web3, Charting the Internet's Next Economic and Cultural Frontier. And the choice of the word frontier is quite intentional. Frontiers, especially this one, because it's online, can be full of opportunity. I would argue in this case that frontier is theoretically boundless. And frontiers attract homesteaders and pioneers, and they attract business people and entrepreneurs. And they also attract hucksters and criminals and outlaws and so forth. And in the early days, every frontier town needs a sheriff. And so I think that there's a role for government, obviously, and for regulations in creating the conditions to bring about the economic opportunity of Web3. In the 1990s, governments around the world, and especially in the United States, recognized this. and made changes to the laws that made it much easier for the web to scale. So for example, the first version of Netscape Navigator that Mark Andreessen developed had weapons-grade encryption built in as a way to allow people to securely move data across the web without it getting hacked. The only problem was, because it was weapons-grade cryptography, in order to so for the international version that they shipped, remember when software used to come on floppy disks and CDs, things like that. So the software that they shipped, they had to take out this encryption software, because otherwise it would have been guilty of exporting arms around the world. So because of the how it was classified. So the government's okay, we're going to change how we qualify this new technology. There was a lot of talk in the 1990s that what we really needed was licenses for people who operate websites. Just like, if the web is a broadcast medium for information, which is what it was, right? Web 1, medium for the static presentation of information on websites, then everyone should be licensed to operate this. So they should all get a CB radio license. So, basically like these kinds of, and so they decided that was a bad idea. And then they introduced this thing called the Telecommunications Act and some other changes to the law, which created the conditions for the web to succeed. So my point is only that today, depending on the country, the approach is very different. So in Europe, there are these laws, these MiCA laws, which govern the token part of Web3. I think we're probably going to get regulations around artificial intelligence as well, which I think done right could be really, really useful. And then I look at what's happening in the U.S. and I'm a little bit concerned, because I think these two big technologies, blockchains and tokens, and then AI, we're in the midst kind of like a moral panic around both of them. And I think that moral panic is clouding people's judgment in how to think about how to create the conditions for them to succeed.
But to put you on to push you a little bit here on, again, the US has just had such a great track record of pioneering internet, Web 1, Web 2, and as you said, most of that 6 trillion is sitting in US companies. And again, there's still a lot of momentum, a lot of activity in the US, but I guess as you're alluding to, some of the conditions may be less favorable. Do you have a view on how dominant do you think the US will be? What are some of the other geographies that you're bullish on in terms of pioneering Web3?
Yeah, well, Silicon Valley was once called a tech Galapagos, which I just love that term. For the unique combination of capital and talent and government R&D and universities and so forth that led to the very special species of tech founder that went on to create these companies. And I think that's an interesting kind of way to think about it, right? Like the web was invented by a British computer scientist in Switzerland, but really it was made in America. Like it was commercialized in the United States.
For sure.
And I think this time is different. In the early 1990s, when the first internet pioneers were building out, the early web, most of the world had never even seen a telephone or picked up a phone before. Most of the internet connections, all of the venture capital industry, most of the government R&D and around this stuff existed in the US. So it was sort of natural that from that grew the internet industry. Today, things are different. I mean, the US is still a dominant player, obviously the dominant player. But technology tools are more distributed than ever. 2/3 of the world's population has access to a smartphone connected to the internet. Smartphone's a supercomputer. Talent is more distributed than ever. Populations are far more educated everywhere in the world. I mean, kids in Korea and Japan and Singapore outcompete their American counterparts in STEM and other areas. So my point is only that we live in a world that is far more globalized, which is a bit of a cliche in a sense, the idea that technology flattens the world. I think that's true, but I think Web3 accelerates that even further, right? If Web 1 created a way for people to access information online and Web 2 gave them a tool to publish and to share content and so forth, then I think Web3 empowers them with a much more robust toolkit, a way to move value, to store value, to build wealth, to find employment, peer-to-peer, digitally online. And I think that it's going to be a steamroller. It's going to flatten the world in ways we haven't expected. So, I think just to tie back to your original question, the regulation piece is part of it. Governments can create the conditions. In Dubai, for example, in the UAE, they've set up a fund to support innovators in the Web3 area, but not everybody wants to live in Dubai. And in the UK, the Prime Minister says he wants the country to be a Web3 center of innovation. And in Singapore, the regulations have been much more progressive, like deeper, not like more liberal or more open, but more thoughtful about where this is all going. So I do believe that we're going to, live in a multipolar world. Like the Silicon Valley of the future isn't going to be a place, or at least not one place. It's going to be globally distributed.
Maybe I'm about to open up for audience questions, so do hack some more in there. But just one more from me before I open up. Just on the speed of this, and we're at a moment where how fast will the adoption be? And again, I'm not asking you to have a crystal ball, but what are some of the things that the industry might need to do, independent of regulation, to hasten adoption and really get some of the positive impacts you see sooner rather than later?
Well, I think I'm not sure that I have a specific set of recommendations. A lot of technologies in the early days, they follow the S-curve trajectory, right? Where there's a lot of research, but there's very little sort of economic gain. There's a lot of like development happening, and then they hit an inflection point where for every dollar you get $5 of sort of output, and then eventually they taper off. And you could look at like the internal combustion engine. At the very beginning they all exploded and they didn't work very well. Well, that was very bad, and then they improved a lot. But nowadays, when it comes to internal combustion engines, all the innovation and R&D in the world is not going to squeeze more energy out of a molecule of gas. And so we needed a new paradigm. We need electric cars to take us to the next level. I think, for example, like when it comes to AI, AI is another overnight success story that is decades in the making. It was Alan Turing who first posed the Turing test to determine whether or not an AI could fool a human being. And it's interesting that he also helped to crack the Enigma machine, which shows that the history of cryptography and AI have been tied to each other since the very beginning of computing. But I digress. And even in the 1960s, there were analysts and researchers in the UK and elsewhere saying that in 20 years, AI was going to replace all humans in every function of the economy. None of that came to pass. And we had a ChatGPT moment last year, basically, where all of a sudden, all this innovation and R&D and stuff that was happening in the background manifested itself in an application that everyone instantly realized and could see was going to change things. It was fun, it was useful, it was amusing, went viral, right? And I think, so on the AI side of things, I think that we're seeing that inflection point. On the virtual reality and extended reality, again, another overnight success story, decades in the making. But I do believe that the Vision Pro headset is going to help people realize that we are headed towards a spatial web. Now, it doesn't mean we're all going to be plugged in as like inert, participants in some virtual world. It just means that the web is going to be three-dimensional. It's already quasi three-dimensional. Smartphones sort of have made it 2.5D, but we're going to get to 3D. And then you think about like IoT and connected devices and smart sensors and so forth. And I think like even like autonomous vehicles is a subcategory of that. We're seeing the rise of autonomous vehicles in San Francisco, and I think it won't be long before those are all on the road. So again, like these technologies are related; they're not separate from each other. And I think in every case, we are at or near sort of that key inflection point.
And so that's great analogies. And I can't resist but asking one follow-up question. So what do you see, though, the interactions, say, between, AR, VR, or especially generative AI and all? I mean, it's just this abundance of content it's spitting out, and Web3 and the ownership, the decentralization that you talk about. Do you see significant interactions in some parts?
I do. I see huge interactions in both parts. So when it comes to AI, when you think about large language models, people are concerned that large language models are basically consuming all of this content, all of this IP, and using it to train and to learn, right? And there's widespread concern that the IP is being used without the creator's consent or even knowledge, and certainly without any attribution or compensation of any kind whatsoever. Now, so to me, this is an example of why culture needs a new business model. Like we need a way to ensure that creators can get compensated when their content is consumed, whether it's consumed by a person or by a large language model for that matter. And we already know that this can work because in Web3, we have a way for creators to get paid from the creation of digital work, but also to get paid on a recurring basis. So one of the things that you can do with a token is you can program it with a smart contract to ensure that every time a asset is transacted or traded or used, that it creates a residual royalty that goes to the creator. And in Web3, Peter, there are at least 300 different projects that have generated at least $1 million of not of original sales, but of residual royalties paid to the creator. So we can use that model and apply it to large language models to ensure that IP and content that goes into those models creates a residual stream of revenue to ensure that the creators get paid fairly. So that's one example. You also mentioned extended reality.
You know what? So Alex, I have to interrupt, but we've got some great questions from the audience. So maybe you should, mindful of time, I'm going to pivot there. Here's one that you were already touching on. I'm a music fan. This is George. I'm told that Web3 will change the fan experience, but how? Obviously, you came at it from music a little bit from the creator point of view, but from the fan point of view in terms of ticket sales, all that. What do you see coming?
Yeah, well, there's an analogy. There's an expression that all you really need are 1,000 true fans to be a creator, right? And it's an interesting sort of way to think about where we're at as it relates to culture. So not to go on too much of a tangent, but for most of history, creators had to rely on wealthy patrons. Industrialization changed that because it allowed you to create something you could sell to a mass market, whether it was a record or a CD or a lithograph or paperback novel or whatever, right? And more recently, technology has a bit of a slightly more checkered kind of past. When it comes to the internet, we took this thing as it relates to music that was an asset. You bought it on a CD or a record and turned it into this free commodity that got reprinted through the web. And so new powerful platforms had to come in and try and create some order from the chaos. But the upshot of that is that creators today make less per unit sale on platforms like Spotify than they did before. So what are ways in which we can change the creator experience? Well, one is that there are new ways to engage with fans. So, a lot of fans like to purchase, collectibles and merchandise and artifacts and so forth of their favorite artists. And so digital goods are one interesting way that they can engage with their fans, especially those super fans that are willing to spend more money. But a more profound example that we cover in the book is the idea of how you engage creators in the process of content creation itself. Now, the examples in the book are not from music. They're more from what I would call interactive storytelling. But basically, one thing that Web3 enables you to do is to sell characters in your story as digital goods to fans and have them participate both creatively and economically in the outcome. So there's a project Shibuya started by a very well-known digital artist called People Pleaser that we cover in the book, and another project MV3, which is sort of like an immersive virtual world like Star Wars or Star Trek, where fans can own characters in the game and participate in it. So the idea here is that we have fans that if you have true fans, they're going to spend more money, and that's good for creators. But B, collectively, you can create something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And C, what's really interesting to me about this is that this model helps to fund creative ventures that maybe wouldn't have gone funded before. It's like crowdfunding on steroids, basically, which is something we've seen in other parts of Web3, but in creative ventures, I think is a really, really interesting frontier.
All right, so here we go, coming out of left field, a totally different type of question. Sort of your views on zero knowledge. So for those who don't know, there's a lot of talk on the more technical side about some advances there. How do you, with your focus on the applications, the impact on commerce and culture, do you see that as significant? And for lay people, how would you describe briefly the significance of ZK?
I do. So zero knowledge proofs are one of 7 primitives that we cover in the book, sort of primitives being like irreducible components that I think form the Web3 world. And basically, like, zero knowledge proof is a way to prove something happened without revealing any details about the thing or about the parties involved, right? So like I send you $100, we can prove that happened without knowing, that it went from Alex to Peter. So, and everyone can verify that. So there are lots of examples in different industries where zero knowledge is really important. Finance is a very good example. If you're accumulating shares in the company because you're planning on taking it over or something, it's important that for a period of time, you can do so without raising suspicion. And the thing about blockchains is that, your address, your wallet, your name is kind of anonymized, but the information is all on chain. It's all there for everyone to see. And so with a little bit of sleuthing, people can find out. So that's one example from finance, but there's all these other really kind of cool and kind of almost far out there examples that I think are just incredibly compelling. So one is, and this is, it's Climate Week in New York this week, and I'm actually in New York right now. And there are all these different requirements for companies to meet their net zero targets. There's SOC 1, SOC 2, and SOC 3. So I don't want to get too technical, but basically it's like SOC 1 and 2 are like, okay, how much energy do I use? Like if I'm Exxon, I use a lot of energy. It's my data center. If I'm Google, whatever. But SOC 3 is, well, how much energy does your supply chain use? And this is a big problem to figure out. It's hard to figure out how much energy your supply chain uses because you need a way to kind of validate and prove what the actual footprint is, but you don't want to give it away. Like if you're Google, like if you're Apple or Google or whatever, any company, like your supply chain is part of your proprietary information about your business. Like it's stuff that you'd rather not share with the whole world. So how do you prove what the footprint is of your supply chain without giving away information about it? And how do you validate it in a way that everyone can trust that data? The only way to do that is with this Web3 toolkit. So zero knowledge proofs have applications in, stocks and bonds and finance, but everything up to, how companies meet their climate targets.
So really, there was a question in there about confidentiality. It's allowing you to get trust and confidentiality, which is, as you say, it's going to be important in many use cases.
Yeah.
Actually, you touched on climate change. So obviously, not surprisingly, some concerns about that, a question about that. Obviously, Bitcoin has a bad rap in terms of energy consumption, although maybe nothing compared to what generative AI is chewing up in terms of energy currently, but we'll leave that aside.
Well, Bitcoin uses more energy than AI models do right now. And the fact that Bitcoin uses a lot of energy is something that we shouldn't paper over because it's something that I think is should be top of mind. Now, a couple thoughts on that. Number one, Bitcoin does use a lot of energy, but so do lots of other things. So by some accounts, Bitcoin uses about as much energy as drying machines in the United States, like washer dryers. And washer dryers are really useful, so maybe that's appropriate. But number two is that because they rely on abundant, cheap power in order to operate, they usually co-locate near sources of renewables. And so of any industry, but like Bitcoin mining is one of the greenest in terms of the share of renewables. But even still, even if half of it's renewable, half of the big number is still a huge number, right? So the good news is that most Web3 development, as it relates to blockchains and tokens, which again is one part of the story, are happening on a different kind of network called a proof of stake network versus a proof of work network. So a Bitcoin network is called proof of work because computers have to do lots of work in order to validate transactions before they get added to the blockchain, which is the record everyone can see and trust. Proof of stake relies on a very different mechanism, basically a form of social consensus that uses no more energy or less energy than your average data center. So for all intents and purposes, the notion that like Web3 is boiling the oceans is a moot point because all of the innovation, most of the innovation around applications as they relate to culture and finance and other industries are happening on systems that are about as energy intensive as AI and traditional data centers are.
Okay, I'm just going to keep throwing these questions at you. So thank you for taking them. Here's Xavier, really interesting. So he's actually in the industry working on Web3 video games. Yeah. But what he observes is they're actually not going to market with the blockchain, the crypto features. They have that behind. They don't get the noise around that. They get people on the games, and then people experience the benefits. So I think it talks a little bit to a little bit the chill that's around some of the crypto stuff. Is that he's curious whether you see other people doing that, sort of, I guess, playing down some of the blockchain features now.
Well, I wonder if it's a chill or if it's just a natural evolution, that when a technology, technology that continues to evolve becomes invisible. I mean, there's this very revealing study that was asked people in the Philippines and Indonesia, how many of you used Facebook? And they said like 80%. And how many of you used the internet? And it was 40%. It's like, you have to use the internet in order to use Facebook, right? So the point is that technology sometimes fades to the background as applications become more fun and intuitive to use. When it comes to gaming, I think it's such a fascinating area because it's the one that to me feels like the area with like the most opportunity short term after finance, because we've seen points. And there's a very simple reason, which is that as a species, like as an economy, as a planet, we spend $100 billion a year already on virtual goods, but we don't actually own them. People spend money on these things without owning them. Every time you buy a Robux in the Roblox ecosystem, or if you buy a skin in Fortnite, or if you're purchasing, an access to a level or to some other, unlocked feature in a video game, you are buying a virtual good. And people are already doing this to the tune of billions of dollars a year, but they don't actually have property rights, right? They don't have the ability to trade those assets, to participate in the wealth creation if their value should increase. And if the creator of the environment, whether it's a video game studio or someone else, changes the rules on them, then they could lose that asset forever. So my thesis there is pretty simple. If you're going to spend money on something, why not own it? Like, why not actually have some ability to control it and to monetize it if you want? So I think when I look at a lot of Web3 games, the problem with a lot of Web3 games is that they did start with token economics first. It was like, play the video game and make some money. And I think that's the wrong approach, because what it does is it attracts the wrong kinds of people to the game. Like in any new industry, you've got your missionaries and your mercenaries. And like the mercenaries in these games were like showing up and extracting all these token rewards and then leaving because they didn't care about the gameplay. So to me, it's just a classic example where like the ownership function of Web3 is really important, but it doesn't mean that it has to be the primary objective in every way, in every kind of thing that Web3 touches, right? In gaming, it's like, yeah, I should be playing a game because it's fun, because I get to hang out with my friends, because, it's a good, rewarding experience. Oh, and by the way, like it's enriched by this component of ownership. That's how we should think about it.
One last question. This is actually the first question that was submitted, going back to some of your opening comments about decentralization. Just it sounds good in some ways, decentralized governance and this kind of stuff, but it can also be quite inefficient. There have obviously been some various issues around DAOs and stuff. What's your view on decentralized decision making? What are we learning about? When does it work? When does it add value?
Well, I think when it comes to decentralized decision making, I'm not sure that it is such a good idea, frankly. I mean, I think in a lot of cases, decentralization means disorganization, and I think that there's a role for people to be in charge. And so I think about DAOs, like distributed autonomous organizations. The fact that they're decentralized is not the thing that actually interests me the most. What interests me the most about DAOs, and just to be clear for everyone who's listening, these are internet native organizations where users, members, developers all can own a piece and have a say in how they're governed through a token, versus say like a company where you're a shareholder or you're a customer and you have no economic say in how it's run. So DAOs help to turn internet users into owners. So we all own parts of these organizations. And to me, the most interesting part of that is that, DAOs take the concept that has always worked in Silicon Valley, which is that to attract the best kinds of people, you need to cut them in on the action, you need to give them ownership, and applies it to the whole internet and applies it to these new kinds of organizations and gives people everywhere a way to participate. So if I was a Silicon Valley startup and I wanted to reward users and contributors in every market I operated in, well, I'd have to like hire lawyers and do like options agreements and like, Romania and the Philippines and Nigeria and Portugal and Mexico. And it would just be too prohibitively expensive to do that. It was 6 different languages right there. But with a DAO, I can incentivize users with tokens instantly and peer-to-peer, like without having to do any of that stuff. So I think DAOs are a really great, really interesting a construct to like organize people and assets and capital across a global, across the web globally. And to do that in a way that companies and traditional kinds of organizations simply have not done before. But when it comes to the organization and the management of those, I think it's okay that a DAO can elect a CEO, basically. I mean, and a board of directors like any other, like we're some equivalent, right? Like you don't need, like decentralization doesn't need to mean disorganization. I just view them as these infinitely programmable new things that we can apply any governance model we want to them. And I think that also in its sense is very exciting.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, we're going to wrap up. I'll have the one final question. I think you talked about this frontier with lots of rewards, but also risks, uncertainty.
Yeah.
What kind of advice do you offer to people thinking about getting involved or people who are out there? And possibly for different types of players. What's some of your key advice looking at this frontier over the next couple of years?
Well, the very first thing that everybody should do, the second that this webinar ends, is buy my book. It's called Web3. The best way to buy it is in massive volume for you and all your friends and family. No, but in all seriousness, getting educated is important. And my book, I guess, is useful. There are lots of other really, really interesting ways to become educated. I think personal use is really important too. I think probably most people on this call have probably interacted with ChatGPT and have probably interacted with digital assets. But if not, like just do that, right? You could read a 200-page book about how the web works, or you could like download Netscape, plug in a modem to your phone line and get on surf the web, which by the way was a horrible experience in 1993 and 1994. So personal use is a precondition to understanding. I think that if you're a business leader, and I suspect many INSEAD alumni who are on this call are, that you need to think carefully about how, especially if you're a leader of an organization that might be impacted by this technology, how do you thread that needle? How do you figure out that innovator's dilemma? Because you actually don't want to invest too much too early. I think like Mark Zuckerberg did that with virtual reality and augmented reality. I mean, he blew $25 billion on this technology and it still hasn't found the right market. So you've got to figure out how to ride the wave. It's kind of like surfing, right? If you're too early or too late, you're going to miss the opportunity. So I think you want to put yourself in a position to succeed. And I would say that, final piece of advice is just to start now. The best time to learn about AI and blockchains and so forth was, probably a few years ago. But the second best time is today. And it's never too late to get started.
All right. Alex, thank you for the time. Good luck with the book tour. Thank you for stopping off with the INSEAD community. Always enlightening. And indeed, I can say the book is a great way to get educated. So thank you, everyone. Take care, Alex.
Thank you. Take care.